I'm Takyapi. This is Nick Estes, co-host of the Red Nation podcast. Welcome to this special live stream event. Before we get into the discussion on Mormon Settler Colonialism, I just have a couple of items that I'd like to discuss, things that you can check out, things that you can do to support Red Media. The first is we are hiring. We are going to close this search for a new executive director fairly soon. But if you look in the show notes or in the chat, whichever platform you're watching, you can find a link to our webpage, or you can just go to redmedia.press. That's redmedia.press, and you'll see a job ad that just says we are hiring. Click on it if you would like to apply. It's also Native American Heritage Month, which means a lot of different things, and also means a lot of nothing, but in some regards. But I think it's also an important kind of time of year to begin thinking about how we're supporting Indigenous-run media. Red Media has a GoFundMe, an ongoing GoFundMe campaign that will also be in the show notes or in the chat. Please click donate what you can. It can be a one-time donation, it can be a recurring donation. And of course, we always encourage you to sign up for our Patreon, which is just patreon.com/redmediapr. That's the best way to support the show. We have actually a backlog of episodes of the Red Nation podcast. So most of our stuff before it goes public on the main feed or on the YouTube channel will be streamed there or published there. So I highly recommend it. We also get some great feedback from our patrons and our subscribers who ask us questions. We try our best to answer them either in the Patreon or live. We got some questions today actually that we might be addressing about this particular book. But nonetheless, that's the best way to support us. We do appreciate everyone who has made contributions over the years. We are, unlike other sort of media platforms, we are heavily subscriber funded. We don't get major grants to run this podcast. But right now, we are really supported by users and listeners of our platforms. So thank you all who have been donating over the years and have been subscribing. It really does mean a lot to us. We've been able to grow. We have plans to grow. And in fact, we are growing because this is, spoiler alert, Elise Boxer has joined Red Media, Dr. Elise Boxer. So she is now on our board of advisors. She is an active, we hope she's going to be an active participant in the Red Media family. So we're excited to have her. That was actually not planned we have some fake applause going. That was actually not planned. We actually scheduled this show before that happened. So it's not like, this isn't just like, now like it's the Elise Boxer show, like it's the Nick Estes show. Just kidding. But congratulations and welcome to Red Media.
Thank you.
Elise, this is your second time on the show
Yes.
within the last month, I think. We had you on in October. We're having you on in November. And, maybe you can just reintroduce yourself to our listeners, where you're calling from. You're at the University of South Dakota, but maybe talk a little bit about what you do there.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to us today. And especially, I'm excited to share on this platform my book that just came out with University of Oklahoma Press. But I am Elise Boxer, Lakota. I am Dakota. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux tribes. I'm located in Northeast Montana. Currently, right now, I reside in Vermilion, South Dakota. I'm an associate professor of history and Native American studies. I'm also the program coordinator for Native American Studies. And then I also hold an administrative position as the director for the Institute of American Indian Studies. All that to say is that I very much am, as a scholar, interested in Indigenous studies and advancing really Indigenous theories and methodologies, both to our students and then also for those faculty who are interested in embedding that within their courses, but also within their own research.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. You are, definitely somebody in the field of American Indian studies, while also kind of sitting outside of it in history. And that very much comes through in this book. and which we're going to talk about. But before we get into this book, I wanted to ask several questions. Some of them are biographical, but also some of them are intellectual, and maybe they kind of converge a bit. But one question that I had was, how, like, was this a dissertation project that became a book? And then also, like, how your personal experiences led to this kind of research, because it is very much a personal story for you.
Mhm. These are great questions, and probably ones I've avoided sometimes, like, right where, one of the things is I do this with my students as well. We all pick histories that we have personal interest in, right? And questions that we want to answer. And so, on a more personal note, and it intersects right with my professional life, is that I was born and raised as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I would say that growing up in Poplar, Montana, the branch, which is like a smaller LDS church, was a very different experience than when I left the reservation and went to Yakima Nation, where my dad eventually took a job as a social worker out there. And I talk a little bit about this in the preface, that move from our community to another tribal community, but just the jarring experiences I had in a predominantly white religion. And then some of that like dissonance in terms of, in the preface, I specifically talk about some children's hymns, right, or songs, and one of them being titled Book of Mormon Stories. And I start my book off with that because I want to be very clear and transparent that this project is personal because it's questions I've always had about how other and non-Indigenous people view Indigenous people within a very religious framework. And I start with that experience because that was the first time I felt, when we moved, I was about 12 years old, that I had a very, I would say, awakening. And I was very aware then that I was different, that my experiences were different, and that things that students were doing, or children were doing, of like playing like the stereotypical, right, like Indian drum, or like even like the keys in which the music is played, mimics, right, these constructs about like Indigenous people, but how just non-Native children kind of just leaned into that, and how uncomfortable that can be. And so those are kind of some of those early kind of recollections I have, where, again, a very dissonance between what I grew up in Poplar to what I experienced elsewhere, particularly as I've gone off to school in other spaces that are predominantly white. Your question about, was this my dissertation? It was my dissertation. I titled my dissertation on a Book of Mormon scripture before 1984 that stated about Indigenous people, or Lamanites, was that as Indigenous people, we would become a white and delightsome people. And that was the first part of my dissertation title. And again, I was really interested in American Indians and like Mormon identity. I would say that time, that when I wrote the dissertation, maybe much like other scholars, I look back and I'm thankful for my committee and passing me and like saying, cool, you're done with this, right? But it's also one of those where I don't think I had the theoretical frame. Well, I did not have the theoretical framework that I use in the book that I have today, but it came out of a conversation that I had with three other non-Indigenous women. And I write about this in an edited volume and in a collection on American Indians and Mormons, because I was interested in very specific incidents that sparked my current trajectory in the book. And specifically, this individual, I happened to be on vacation with. We had one of my friends, we finished our master's degree together. She was a year after me. And to celebrate, we went on this trip. Long story short, during that conversation, these white Mormon women had questions about Native people. And it was interesting because it was really these deficient narratives, right? Like, why are Indian people alcoholic? Why don't you guys go off to get an education, right? And eventually we kind of circled around to the Book of Mormon as my history and my being as an Indigenous person. And I, at the time, was finishing my coursework, my first year of coursework at Arizona State University. I had just finished taking a class with Waziatowin, who is a Dakota historian. And if you haven't read her work, I highly recommend everyone to just go read anything she's written. But she's also very much a community centered individual, right? And very much about like activists and activism in general, but she's very pointed in her remarks. And one of the things that came out of this conversation that I told these young women was that that's not my history, you know, and one specific person kept pushing back. And her remark eventually was, if I understood my history, I would understand that our people, or Indigenous people, we have always been violent people. We've always been a bloodthirsty people. And that I just needed to kind of like reckon with that. And to this day, I cannot tell you what I said in response. I do know that I was very pointed in my critique about just colonialism in general, and then about history. And that young woman cried. And I mean, I didn't feel bad really, because I felt like if you're going to say racist things about me or our people and like our history, then I will also come back to you directly about it. And that became the catalyst, because what was concerning to me at the time was that these are women who had finished bachelor's degree at various different institutions, right? They had served a mission for the LDS Church. And in fact, the girl that made the comments was finishing up her first year of law school. And I thought like, wow, like if this is educated, you know, what I would consider educated people's views of Indigenous people as Lamanites, what are other people thinking? And so that kind of piqued my interest, and really kind of that became part of like the research I was interested in doing and answering those questions. Like how does the LDS Church, based on religious doctrine and speeches, construct this idea about the Lamanite, about Indigenous people, as both a racialized and religious other, in which Indigenous people will always remain really a marked people. Oh, Nick, you're on mute.
You just cited Waziatawi, whose book I just put in the chat. That's one of several books that she's published called "What Does Justice Look Like?" And very much, I think this book is in that sort of spirit, especially maybe not so much centering Indigenous perspectives, but definitely critiquing the institution of Mormonism, as you call it, you know, as an institution of white supremacy. And before we get into that sort of critique, because I do have some questions about the strategic decisions you made, and like to focus on, you know, certain sort of archives, or to focus on certain sort of texts. But I think it might help for some people who are not familiar. I'm not 100% familiar. I only found this out because missionaries came to my door, and then, or elders came to my door, who are not elders, they were young people, but elders came to my door. And then also I had some friends, some Maori and Lakota friends who were Mormons, and I learned about this. And this question never came up, by the way, with my Indigenous friends, but it did come up with the white elders that I had talked to, because that was one of the biggest. I was like, wait, so who are the Lamanites? Are we like, because I was like really confused. I was like, wait, you think that we came in like 600 BC, and then we became like, we were like European, you know, we looked like Vikings or something like that, and then we were transformed into dark, you know, a darker people. But anyways, just for our listeners, can you give as best of a synopsis of the history of the term Lamanite, and its sort of importance to the Mormon Church?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, again, very briefly, without getting into the actual doctrinal questions that people may have, this is something that I very pointedly say I'm not interested in interrogating the veracity of the Book of Mormon, right? I'm more interested in how the text contained within the Book of Mormon gets interpreted. And so in a nutshell, the Book of Mormon begins right in basically Jerusalem. And there's a group of individuals, Lehi, his family, and followers, who basically are experiencing religious persecution, eventually have visions, right? And they, again, escape into what we now would consider the American continent. And so with that, they start a civilization. It starts with Lehi and his children, but the one son that we know a lot who eventually starts to write this account in the Book of Mormon is one of his younger sons, Nephi. And basically, quite simply, we know of 4 named sons, which is Laman, Lemuel, Nephi, and also the other brother, which I'm totally blanking on the name right now, which is not necessarily relevant to
Ishmael?
That's another follower.
Okay.
And so I want to say Samuel maybe might be the fourth one. And apologize for those out there who are interested, but what you really need is two of the brothers, which is Nephi and then Laman. These two brothers basically start to butt heads over the interpretation and basically the commandments that they're given by their father via God. So Lehi again is seen as a prophet, and he receives direct revelation about God, about their presence in what is now the Americas, and that again, these two brothers at odds to one another. Laman, again, is unrighteous, and then Nephi and his followers are going to be considered righteous. And in order to mark the brothers, right, and to differentiate them, they are, especially when you talk about Laman, which is then Lamanites as the people, and their descendants are going to be marked with a skin of blackness. And so you'll see different kind of interpretations of that, a physical darkening, right? Or if it's like a spiritual darkening, but nonetheless, right, in the title page of the Book of Mormon, it eventually does say that American Indian people today may be among those descendants that appear in like the Book of Mormon. And so the reason why it becomes important for a variety of different things is that, at least my analysis of it, is that one, what we see is that Indigenous people are seen as immigrants to the continent, right? And the larger story about like Christianity in general, what we see is that these are also going to be some of like the lost tribes of Israel. The argument, right, is that Indigenous people are one of the 10 lost tribes, and that the other part that is significant is how that text becomes again used to become the foundations of what I argue is like the subject position or this racialized right identity. And so and that Book of Mormon, right, and at the very end of it, right, like as you see them like Mormon writing at the very end of it, which is like another prophet, like they hide the scriptural text in the hills, later to be discovered by Joseph Smith. And again, according to Joseph Smith, right, like he accounts for these visions, much like Lehi, right? He is also a prophet, or he receives direct revelation from Heavenly Father or God, and that ultimately he is shown where these gold plates, or the book, what eventually will be called the Book of Mormon, are unearthed. And that becomes, again, a tie to what is now Mormons, right? Where that scriptural text as the Book of Mormon is seen as in addition to the Bible, but that scriptural text becomes like Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith again plays an important role in like in a sense that quote unquote rediscovery of a text, right? And that then again, as he talks about it in context to American Indian people, you'll see various speeches or writings of Joseph Smith that refers that interpretation of Lamanites as found in the Book of Mormon are ultimately going to be American Indians, or what he terms at the time Western tribes. And that identity is important because it changes over time. So while it began as a very limited identity to the Western tribes here in the United States, as the LDS Church grew, as it became a more global religion, you also see that definition expand even more to include individuals in like the Pacific Islands, right? Eventually in Mexico, Central and South America, and as it's become more broad definition. And you'll see it expand and contract at various times that align with different leaders within the LDS Church. And that's still, even though people will argue that the LDS Church no longer uses those definitions, there are people who were raised in really the 1950s, 60s, and 70s with then Apostle Spencer W. Kimball, but eventually the prophet of the LDS Church, President Kimball. He was seen as a quote unquote Lamanite prophet, where he wanted to actively convert Indigenous people. And so because of his efforts, right, you have like programs established at Brigham Young University, right, that are recruiting actively American Indian students. You then have, again, like different missions. There's like the Northern Indian Mission, for example, up in Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. They have probably the most well-known is the Southwest Indian Mission, but the goal really was to focus resources, including missionaries, to convert Indigenous people in the hopes that Indigenous people are going to see the promises or that history in the Book of Mormon, that again, as long as they follow God and his teachings, they're going to regain their status as a promised people. And that's ultimately what I find fascinating about the Book of Mormon, is that the goal is that indigenous people are supposed to drop those quote unquote scales of darkness. And by embracing, right, religion, specifically Mormonism, will they then become and regain that status as a promised people? Which of course I find problematic for a variety of different reasons. But I would say in a very, very small synopsis, I would say those are the overarching themes of the Book of Mormon, and then ways in which that gets implemented at various moments to indigenous peoples.
I think so. That's synopsis. And I'm not a religious historian, nor am I an expert on the Book of Mormon. But I'm going to just make a guess that, tribal histories, American Indian histories, indigenous histories in this land that predate the writing of the Book of Mormon by millennia, if not like countless generations, have no history or recording that this actually happened. So this is coming from one sort of text and one sort of interpretation. But it also reminds me a lot of previous discussion we had with Justin Potter on the book of Joshua, the Bible, and the way that this book has been used to sort of justify the conquest of Palestine, or this area that's known as Palestine, and sort of creating in the same way these kind of these figures of acknowledging that there were people here before, but trying to explain their existence in different ways, like as in terms of like inherently corrupt or having turned away from the true God. They become the Canaanites, or the Amalekites, I think is what they're called today. And they constantly get reinvoked, and they're not necessarily just a historic figure, or historic peoples at one point in time, like in the case of Joseph Smith, like in the 19th century. Then it gets expanded to other groups of people to include them as sort of this, in the settler project, essentially, as people who are marked as different, who can be usurped and don't necessarily have the rights or the sort of the equality, the divine equality,
Right.
according to whatever sort of religious doctrine. And before we get into that sort of question, I want to maybe just kind of like talk a little bit about who Joseph Smith is, because I think that's an important context in like what he kind of founds in his day, because he doesn't live very long. He ends up getting killed, I believe, in like the 1840 or the 1840s. I can't remember the exact date, but he was born in like early 1800s. He wasn't, as far as I know, based on your book, based on other things that I've read, he wasn't necessarily like a religious person growing up, but nonetheless, he becomes a leader of this church, and kind of setting aside whatever sort of prophetic visions that he has, and kind of what he writes in the Book of Mormon. I think it's important to sort of put a little bit of historical context on who he was and the kind of people he was like, or the kind of world he lived in, the settler world that he lived in, to sort of begin this project.
Yeah. So that's a really, again, like looking at Joseph Smith, and I do spend some time just kind of painting a picture of him in general, because like you said, I think it's important to understand, like, unfortunately, he's not unique with like the questions that he's asking, right? And so again, kind of that narrative that and really that we see in like the religious doctrine of the LDS Church is like Joseph Smith is a young boy, right? He's a young, like 12-year-old who's like asking questions about like, what is the right church? Where should I go? And he didn't grow up in a very religious household to begin with, although his family at various moments have been religious on both the maternal and paternal side. But this is again to kind of coincide with larger American history of really this moment of like the second great like awakening, right? Where there's a lot of religious fervor that is happening, right? And even if you look at Palmyra, like New York in general, right, he is in close proximity to different like religious organizations to begin with, but pretty much ultimately at such a young age, he is being told none of these are, the right church. And the reason I think his story is important, because he has these interesting questions, right, about not just religion, but I think about largely and more broadly about belonging, right? And so when I think about like his story within the context of settler belonging, I think kind of just tying back to what we were talking about previously, like this story is interesting because he's able to make this connection, right, to other like religious figures in the Book of Mormon, like Lehi and others, right? But part of it is that like I guess like that he is there at this particular moment that's necessary. He becomes like this bridge, right, between like an old world and like the quote unquote new world. And it's really pivotal for Joseph Smith to follow like that particular path in order for Mormonism to exist. And I think what makes Mormonism unique is that it's a very American religion, right? It originates here in the United States, in New York. And even that idea of like a Mormon settler center, I think, is also interesting because that Mormon center shifts with Joseph Smith. So even though he may start originally in New York, continues to grow and become like this young religious leader unto his own right, that story about like religious persecution becomes important to what I argue is to really secure their place, right, and their right to land, not just through the religious doctrine, right, but as a religiously persecuted people who are carrying like this God's mantle, for the lack of a better phrase, like they have a legitimate right to land. And that center shifts with Joseph Smith, and eventually they end up in like Missouri, right? They go up to, and then that's where his story becomes more complicated. But even when you look at like his death, right, being killed for his religious beliefs, that martyrdom becomes significant as Mormons secure their belonging, right, to not just the places where they're occupying, but also in their righteous beliefs about, I think, ultimately indigenous peoples. And I recognize like Joseph Smith is interesting and complicated all at once, but as like a figure that I can point to say like he plays a pivotal role in terms of propagating the story about the Book of Mormon, about Lamanite people. His own fascination of indigenous people ultimately shapes how the LDS Church interacts and engages indigenous people. And again, what I always find interesting about it is that his views about Native people are interesting because unlike, like the Black Mormon experience, Native peoples are interesting in that there is like this push by Smith and others to save, right, indigenous people. And he is, I liken him unto kind of like the Great White Father, but like a Mormon version, right, where he wants to be like the middleman in some ways when it's convenient to the larger project of Mormon empire. And even the image on the front of my book cover, that is, an interpretation of someone who thinks like when Sauk and Fox Indian people came to Nauvoo, right, like he's addressing them and like preaching unto them. And you'll see even in his hand, right, he's holding that Book of Mormon, although upside down and not printed correctly if you look at the spine of the book. But it's an artist's like rendition, right, of it. But we don't know if that actually happened, right? We don't know if like that's how he ultimately preached to them. The reason those particular tribal groups were going to Smith and to other Mormons was because they were looking for allies, right? They were looking to have people like the Mormons to really support, the protection of their land. And that's where I think, again, it gets complicated and interesting, especially with like Joseph Smith ultimately. But I think it's important in terms of just understanding where his views of Native people as very paternalistic. People will categorize, and other scholars will say like, well, Mormons were better than their peers at the time. And my argument is that they were no better. And, they just use different language to describe indigenous people as still the others.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think it's, I think about it, and when I was reading this, is like there's so many like it's easy to kind of set Mormonism aside and be like, it's this kind of uniquely bizarre, exceptional kind of religion, but in reality, it's like operating alongside of like a puritanical or Protestant sort of settler colonialism. You can add whatever kind of religious designation or Christian designation to it, but at the end of the day, it's kind of functioning the same way. That I think what's what is unique about it, and what I think what you kind of bring out in this, is that it is taking like what previous sort of Puritan sort of preachers and thinkers and settlers kind of saw as, this is the new Jerusalem, or the new sort of the Palestine, or the Israel. Like, they're looking at the new world as like the promised land, right? Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon sort of reinvents this landscape entirely as Zion, as the sort of place that there will be a sort of, like, he, in Joseph Smith's quest, and then his subsequent followers after he was killed, are like kind of looking for creating not just an extension to the United States, even though they're very much American, as you said. This is very much like Euro-American settler religion. They are like kind of almost like seeking a sort of separate sovereignty, or like a Mormon sovereignty in the West, and trying to recreate this kind of vision that they have, or this mythical sort of place that they have that's founded in their religious texts. And so in some ways it's like they're invoking what are kind of commonly held beliefs of Christian sort of Zion or Zionism. And I would say Mormonism is a form of Zionism in that sense, because it's seeking it's a prophecy driven sort of movement that's kind of tied to settler colonialism in this particular way. But I want to ask like a question, because I was reading this book and I was like, wow, you could go so many directions with this. Yeah. You could go, and it would have been like an 800-page book if you probably even longer, because there's so many elements that are left out. And I want to kind of ask maybe what your sort of strategic thinking is behind this, because you focus on the Book of Mormon as a text, which I think is really fascinating. And from what I can tell, I don't know the literature, but I think it's like the first sort of critical indigenous interpretation of that text. And then you move on to looking at what is it called? Nauvoo? Is that what it's called?
Nauvoo, yeah, the Council of 50.
Yeah, Nauvoo and the Council of 50. And then you look at let me look at the table of contents, because you move through this in a chronological way. Then you look at what you call the pioneer, or the Mormon pioneer settler landscape, which is kind of the American West. And then finally you turn to the Indian Student Placement Program and redemption of Lamanite children, which I think is fascinating, because that redemption of Lamanite children actually gets left off a lot of these things, but that is the sort of the project. But I just want to maybe like get your thoughts on like why you chose these 4 specific case studies, and maybe ones that you are working on like in other projects, because I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, so this is one where like this has been a project that I've been working on since I started I would say here at University of South Dakota, and through life circumstances I've kind of revisited here and there, and also engaged the things that I was interested in and looking at. And I think what became important, or at least legible to me, was that one, and you kind of mentioned this a little earlier, in terms of it's not really about centering Indigenous voices. I feel like that's another book project, because first I wanted to make visible the structures of Mormon settler colonialism. And I was thinking about what are the ways in which I could make that visible to other Mormon scholars, right? But also to members themselves, and then also to tie it in broadly into just looking at religions in general. Because again, as you mentioned, and as I kind of point out in the book, it's like there's always interesting like Mormon exceptionalism that's even more exceptionalism than US like exceptionalism, right? But we leave the LDS Church or Mormon settlers really off of that kind of discussion, right? Even when we talk about like residential or boarding schools, we leave out child removal in general, especially by the LDS Church, and especially in through the Indian Student Placement Program. So really that first chapter was, again, I wanted to make visible the roles in which like Joseph Smith played in using the Book of Mormon, right, to create stories of not just Mormon belonging, but then also really how they are starting to begin that racialization of Indigenous people. And so that's why I thought religious text, and then pointing out some other doctrine and speeches and things, right, how that becomes the foundations for the ways in which people understand ultimately Indigenous people. So that's really that I felt like that first chapter became important, is because how do we take doctrine and a text and say this then influences our understanding, right, of racial formations. And this is really interesting because I just recently had read Bethany Hughes' book on like red face, and she talks about red face in the context of theater. And as I start to go back and like rethink about other projects and even rethink the work that I'm doing, I want to note that this is not meant to be like the only word. I hope that I continue to engage in the topic and really change and become more critical in probably the things that I'm doing or the different things that I'm engaging with. But one of the things that's interesting is how, again, it's not just the audience engaging, right? So using members as like the audience, like how are members reading this and then interpreting and then applying it, right? And I think that then becomes evident again. And like when I take like this, again, like episodic approach of, okay, so then the next chapter on the Council in 50 is Nauvoo is important because we see Nauvoo from like a very Mormon perspective as a place in which they experienced, again, religious persecution. But I use this both as like a literal figurative argument to say Nauvoo is literally on the periphery of the American frontier at this particular moment. But at the same time, as they're building up their Mormon Zion, they're doing so because they benefited from Indigenous removal and dispossession. They're also perpetuating that in themselves as they go into Wisconsin Territory and other places to, again, extract resources from the land. And again, their very presence is based on the premise of Indigenous removal. And so I wanted to also point out, in terms of looking at the Council of 50, is that they have always been fascinated and interested in the ideas of Mormon empire and what did that look like, because it was always moving west, right? And that those visions of Zion change. And I think it's important that it's in that you show the fluidity of that, right, to serve that purpose, because that Mormon center is fluid for a purpose, because it then can align with, oh, this doctrine is changing, right? The interpretations are changing to suit their purposes, because they already got expelled from Missouri, they get expelled from Nauvoo, then they go right west. And I really want to use that idea of, again, and that chapter on Mormon pioneers and like that pioneer landscape is really that move west, that trek west becomes important in terms of how that actual movement becomes central to their story of belonging. And what we get out of that story is really the complete erasure of Indigenous people. There's no mention of really Indigenous people unless they are stopping, right, or standing in the way of like Mormon empire. And then those Indigenous people eventually who be included in that kind of Mormon narrative are those that prop up and, again, sanction Mormon settler presence in what eventually is going to be like Salt Lake Valley. But part of that movement and part of like the making of space as a very distinct Mormon space is to make it visible. You know, prior to my arrival here at USD, as I taught at University of Utah for 2 years. And that's, again, kind of some of my ideas. And even growing up within the LDS church, what is a pioneer day? What does that look like, right? And how does that kind of, again, ritual secure, again, and reinforce and naturalize Mormon whiteness? And so that's really what that chapter is trying to do, and to really make visible, again, the landscape that gets marked as distinctly Mormon. And then finally, that last chapter, again, is really just to say, like, Mormons are unfortunately like other settlers, right? And much like the United States, and they created an educational program that was designed to assimilate Native people. The only difference, right, is that it happens within the Mormon religious context as, again, to fulfill their obligation to Indigenous people. Because behind this, right, it's not just that Indigenous people are Lamanites, it's also that for, again, non-Indigenous people, in order for them to be redeemed, they have to redeem Lamanite people. And so they have that obligation, right, to Indigenous people, because their own eternal salvation, in a sense, is on the line. And so that is why, again, it's problematic for a variety of different reasons, but it's not actual redemption of Indigenous people for the sake of redeeming Native people, right? It's really because they're more concerned with their own, right, salvation, that they're going to do this, whether or not that program makes sense. And there's so many different like people and scholars who've written about the Indian student placement program. And it's not meant to be that chapter comprehensive history. Again, it's about making visible those structures of how do Mormon Indigenous people make sense of their identity within the LDS church, because they're making these decisions and choices because of these external constructs, right? And much like Indigenous people today, without the religious kind of like layers and those complicated layers of colonialism, right? Is that it's really to say, like, just as Indigenous people wrestle with what does it mean to be Indigenous, right? Does that mean people have to be enrolled? Does it mean they have to speak their language? Does it mean they grow up in community? Then you take that, right, and you add on this religious like construct, makes it very difficult and challenging for many people to negotiate their identity. And what I wanted in that sense was just to the literature or like the sources and oral histories that were available that other scholars utilized to say they like this program, they think it's great. But if you read between the lines and provide, again, how do those voices exist within the structures of Mormon settler colonialism, and what we can say is that those were detrimental to those children, is because, again, they're part of this larger story of like child removal and assimilation. And then finally, I really just conclude the book with yet another modern example, right, of Mormon settler colonialism in the publication of their what they would consider like the Sunday school manual titled Come Follow Me in 2020, where they perpetuate some of the same racialized language about Indigenous people. And then also at the Manti Temple located in Utah, it's considered a pioneer, right, temple, but there's an investment in the preservation of murals. And in doing so, like those murals, again, are problematic because of how they're depicting Indigenous people. But again, it's also naturalizing Mormon settler colonialism at the same time. Oh, wait, Nick, again, you're muted.
God, I'm an amateur today. It's like I've never podcasted before.
Well, let me teach you the ways.
That's why you're taking over. You know, as I was reading this, I was thinking a lot about some of my friends and my colleagues who do research on Catholic-run boarding schools.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them, Katie Holscher at the University of New Mexico, you should check her out. Her work is really great. She does a mapping Catholic-run boarding schools project in the West. But one of the things she talked about was, you know, and this is also in some of the literature around who actually worked at these boarding schools, like the Christian ones, but also the state runs or the federal run boarding schools. It was often people who, like, so for example, on the Christian side or the religious side, it was often groups like the Catholics who couldn't really, like, who were a marginal kind of religious sect in the United States, were kind of like they kind of, that's where they got their money. That's where they they inserted themselves into this thing, and they got federal monies to do this because there weren't a lot of sort of Protestant, you know, groups going out and doing this. So the Catholic Church kind of cornered that market, so to speak. And I don't know if that's the case necessarily with Mormonism, but I do kind of feel like it is, and especially because it's more regional in the West, because there was more presence there, and you just didn't have the same kind of. This is me speculating. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but you didn't have the same kind of like reach or presence of these other, you know, Christian sects in these regions, the same way that you had sort of the reach and presence of like Mormon missionaries, specifically on or around reservations.
Right.
The other one is my friend Khalil Johnson writes about how people so you have this sort of religious, I'll call it quote unquote religious tolerance, right, for these Christian sects, but then internally within the boarding school system, the people that they employed were oftentimes Black people, because they, you know, the federal service was desegregated, unlike the private sphere, right? So you had a lot of Black teachers. This is something that's not really talked about, but in BIE schools, Bureau of Indian Education schools, some of them were predominantly Black. And we kind of forget that history. And it's like this, so like colonialism is like, there's all these kind of internal contradictions within it, right? Even like, you know, the Catholics even have a sort of oppression narrative too, to say, well, we were an oppressed, minority when we came here. The Ku Klux Klan hated us, or whatever it is, or you have like Mormons, kind of in this early period in the 19th century, kind of comparing their oppression to that of the oppression of Native people, like even saying that the attack on these Mormon settlers was akin to the massacre, the Sand Creek massacre of Cheyenne people. So like it's like really fascinating too, and it's like you said it, and I'm glad you said it, because it to me, I was trying to figure out, is like, can Mormonism exist without the Lamanite? And kind of what you're saying is that the way it's structured now, it actually can't, because it needs to save something, right? And this is the kind of issue of that was kind of presented in Latin America, especially around sort of these Catholic missions, right? Even like going back to Bartolome de las Casas and the debates he had about whether Indians had souls. Like it didn't matter. Like that debate is not really as important as the fact that Catholics see it as their duty to convert people. Like they need Indians more than Indians need them, right? And that's kind of what woke me up to this whole thing about like Catholicism and missionization and conversion, is that it's actually a validation of the church and less a validation of the humanity of the people who are under conversion, right? And I was thinking about this too, and I can't remember if I read this correctly. I should have taken better notes. But did you say that they actually edited the Book of Mormon, like the actual text, to kind of like soften the Lamanite a little bit, because it kind of was they were depicted as kind of like savage, violent people, and then they kind of like went back and tried to rewrite it? Is that correct?
They eventually revised like that title page, where it used to be very direct, right? To say American Indian peoples are the descendants, right, of Lamanites, basically, that are in the Book of Mormon. And then eventually the phrase is like maybe amongst, although I don't think it softens it a little bit, right? And but that change is made kind of like I want to say undercover. It wasn't as like an announcement. Usually the LDS Church does a lot of their announcements through their press room releases. But this is where I think, again, it's important to name these kind of structures and make it visible, is because regardless, even that publication in the 2020, right, publication of a handbook that went out to millions of members of the LDS Church, that interpretation of that doctrine ultimately, right, of like a skin of blackness to imply that you are cursed as a people because we are brown, remained. And so I think it's interesting, because even people who are, trying to interpret that still interpret that as like there are, right, Indigenous people or American Indian people. So it remains embedded in what I would say like the cultural fabric of members. And that's how these ideas get perpetuated and remain, right, as part of like this like colonial imaginary about Indigenous people. And then the other, I think what's interesting, again, is just to kind of reinforce that point, is that the Lamanite subject position, and even what I term like that Mormon settler subject position, those go hand in hand. One cannot exist without the other. And so Indigenous people are never going to fulfill their promised, they're never going to become fully promised, right, and regain their glory, because in doing so, it means we don't need that Mormon settler project. And in fact, there is an elder that I used to talk to about my project in the early formations of it, and his name was Tom Joseph, an older gentleman that I went to church with when I lived out in California. And what was interesting is that he took a more radical interpretation of the Book of Mormon, and rather than reject it in the way that I did, he in fact embraced it and said, if people really read the Book of Mormon as a literal text and said that Indigenous people or Lamanites are a promised people, then it's not the Gentiles who are ushering in the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's in fact Lamanites. We are, right, we as Indigenous people, he would argue, are building Zion. We are welcoming and ushering in that second coming. He's like, but Mormons are not ready for that conversation, because it means that they're no longer relevant to that particular goal, right? And I thought it was like a really interesting, and I always still kind of continue to wrap my head around that. And I admit, like, I'm I'm still not wholly convinced by it, but going back to the other question you had earlier about like other projects that I have in mind, and one is really interrogating this idea of Zion, because I'm interested in like what does that idea look like when you place it within the larger conversation, really of U.S. federal Indian policy, because again, Mormons are not unique, and in fact, benefited from U.S. federal policies of like expansion or, you know, again, dispossession of indigenous people. But I'm curious to see what that looks like if you overlay their project of Zion, but especially the fluidity of Zion, how it changes. And I can see in some of like the chat and comments, right, is like that Mormon corridor stretched all the way up into what is now like parts of like Montana, like Idaho, all the way down to Arizona, right? Other parts. And if you look at even today where there's strongholds of like Mormon members, it's on that like Mormon corridor. And I always find that fascinating in general of, you know, Zion and what that would look like, but then how that fits into, again, just larger US federal policies and doctrine of discovery as well.
Yeah, it reminds me like even like Sarah Winnemucca. I remember when I first read her autobiography, Life Among the Paiutes, which in many ways can be considered like one of the first anti-rape sort of tracks in the United States. I mean, or what became the United States. And one of her concerns was, you know, I mean, you have to really read between the lines, but she is talking about sexual violence perpetrated against Indigenous women. And this is like the sort of pressures of like, you know, Mormon settlers in this particular region, ranchers who are kind of expanding into the Paiute Reservation, which is, ironically enough, the Malheur Wildlife Reservation, which was later taken back over by Mormon radicals, Mormon radical settlers in the form of the Ammon, you know, the Ammon and the Bundy movement. But I was just thinking about like how there are, yeah, and it opens up, I think, like I would love to see like what your interpretation of this text, of that kind of text would be, and like how there were, you know, and it's not just, again, it's not the single, I think it doesn't do justice to kind of single out Mormonism. I think a less mature version of myself would have done that, but a more intellectually mature person, like seeing now, especially like with the genocide in Palestine, and like the way that these kind of religious texts get used to justify really extreme forms of violence, and how there is at the end of the day sort of the logic, the circular logic contained within them. It does not allow for the achievement, as you're saying, of sort of emancipation from that project. It's like we're always kind of continually rescripted, and by we I mean like the darker people of the world writ large, not just the Indigenous people, are always kind of rescripted as lesser than, right? And so if a text or institution is founded, you know, intrinsically founded on, you know, white supremacy or white supremacist notions, if it's literally baked into the cake of that thing, I don't know how you unbake a cake. You know? But I guess sort of my final sort of question is going back to this other question, and I've actually never heard this, and so when I was reading this, I didn't really make these connections, but I didn't know that Mormons internally with the Mormon institution and church considers themselves a chosen people. I didn't actually know that was the kind of language that they use. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of how it's imbricated within this kind of broader settler colonial ideology, because it's not just confined to the United States. You now see these mission projects popping up in Central America. There's actually a massive Mormon church in Caracas in Venezuela. They're popping up everywhere, and it's not just it's not just a settler colonial project, but it kind of follows the roots of empire as well.
Yeah, I actually like that phrase, like the roots of like empire. And I think just like thinking about that question broadly, it's really interesting because I think as I tie it into like Mormon understandings of Indigenous people, right? Like, again, kind of go hand in hand with one another. And it's interesting, right? Where this idea, when we talk about like Mormons in general, like this idea of a chosen people, it's really this idea that they, again, are have really the most truest form of what we would consider like Christianity, right? Because of modern day revelation, like the Book of Mormon. And that's what marks them like distinct from other groups as well. And then it's interesting too, in terms of like formations of like that particular subject position, really in the 19th century, like by Joseph Smith and others, is really interesting because, again, there's other Mormon scholars who talk about Mormon whiteness in a very different aspect than I do. And theirs is interesting in that they make an argument is that, and I think you kind of alluded to this earlier with that kind of comparison with Sand Creek Massacre, right? Is that Mormons, it's because of their chosen status that they get persecuted, right, or misunderstood as a people. And I'm not to say that to say that they haven't experienced religious persecution, but ultimately, at the end of the day, at those particular moments that I point to, they still remain white. It is their very whiteness that allows them to, again, expand. And much like you're talking about, like those roots of empire, those ideas and those definitions serve their purpose as they expand their missionary work, right? And so even if you look specifically into Central and South America, what's interesting today about the LDS Church is there's more members that live outside the United States than within. And that majority of members, I would say, if I remember correctly, is that majority of members are Spanish speaking. And so that idea of Lamanite gets shifted to our relatives like in Central and South America, because it's really this idea. And if we use that example that you provided of like Venezuela or others, right, like that huge growth supports, again, still the missionary impulses, right, to convert people, because they're converting not just because of religious doctrine, but they're converting because of their connection, right, as Indigenous people. There is a whole body of literature, and then I would say even what I would call probably religious tourism that ties into stories about like Tenochtitlan, right, like Mayan people, and others, to say, look, we wrote about this in the Book of Mormon. This is in the Book of Mormon. This is where we think Book of Mormon lands are. And so it's kind of interesting in that specific context to tie that idea of like empire, again, to kind of predate, right, Indigenous people on their very lands. But then also the question too is, how else do you expand outside? And you have to see those ideas of change, particularly when we talk about the Brazil, I said context, right? Because Brazil is interesting as a country, but because of like enslavement, right? And then Indigenous people at a certain moment, and really like leading up to the 1978 change of the belief that Black members could not be full members of the LDS Church. I believe like is that ultimately that change is because you were having people convert, right, in places. But then also at the same time, you're not even tapping into a whole nother market of Africa. And how can you convert people who literally will never become full members unless something changes? And so then you have that official declaration too, is what it's called, ultimately change, to say, yeah, we may have said this in the past, but now, no, every worthy male, right, can receive the priesthood, etc. All that to say is that all of these are like intimately tied with one another, especially when you talk about like Mormon empire outside the US. Those missionary impulses coincide with the way that they're reframing the idea of a chosen people, where they're reframing ideas about Lamanite, and then how do you connect people in to still in a very American church where the majority of leadership still comes primarily within the United States.
Wow. Yeah, this is truly an imperial religion,
Yeah.
like an imperial missionary project. And yeah, I mean, again, it's like there you can trace this almost with every major religion in the United, or every major Christian sort of denomination in the United States, maybe with some exceptions.
Yeah.
But by and large, like this is kind of like a very kind of a missionary project, and it's definitely like related to, you know, it's not, you can't remove it from like the sort of designs of US imperialism, right? So like in Latin America or even in Brazil, this is, if you go into these areas where there's either kind of an influx of Mormon conversion or Protestant, or they call it evangelical conversion, it often follows industry. It often follows the clear cutting of the rainforest, the implementation of ranching and cattle farming and stuff like that. So it's often tied to sort of an economic endeavor as well to expand industrial agriculture in this case.
Right.
It's so much aligned with the imperial project, both internally within the domestic realm of the United States, but also externalized abroad. And it just makes me wonder. It's like, because I was reading some of these, some of the responses to some of the survivors and the people who lived through this kind of child removal process, and their sort of justifications, and maybe they're, even kind of trying to reclaim this notion of Lamanite. And part of me was like, somebody who studied boarding schools, and talking to my own family, it's just like, you're always going to find somebody who's going to say something positive.
Yep.
And it doesn't negate like the tragic or the horrible or the nightmarish experiences or the violent experiences of people who maybe didn't survive that process, or did survive it, or is living with the consequences of it and then totally rejecting it. And it reminds me, I gave a talk at the Gustavus College. I think I'm misnaming it. It's tied to the Nobel Prize, but anyways, it's a college outside of Mankato, Minnesota. And there was a security guard. She actually came into my talk, and she was telling me she was from Pine Ridge, and she said, "Yeah, I don't speak any of my language because I was sent away, to one of these Mormon schools." And she's like, "I don't want anything to do with the church. I don't want anything to do with religion. The fact that it did this to me," she's like, "I can't, have to live with the consequences. It's not like it's not a theoretical thing for me, and it just reminded me, it's like, these are real people's lives. It's not just like the redemption of white people. Like this is also the attempted destruction of indigenous nations and dignity."
Yeah. And I really appreciate that, because again, I think that's what is important about this particular I think this conversation in general, right? Because it's easy in a sense to also dehumanize those that went through it by, again, just talking about like structures. But like, that's where I think, again, like the lived experiences of people become important, because and that's what I'm hoping, at least with this book project and just having the conversation in general, right? Is that this impacted people in a variety of different ways and continues to impact people, right? Where I think people are making some choices on how to exist, not just as Indigenous people, but how do you just exist, right? And I want those individuals, and I kind of close my book with that. Like, I want this to give voice to those who felt like they never could have criticisms, right? Who never could say that, yeah, well, it may have been positive for some people, but it wasn't for me. And I think it's okay to have those spectrum of experiences to say, cool, there's always someone that's going to say something good, right? Or like, right, that idea even about boarding schools, well, we made it our own, but at what cost, and who was lost in the process, right? And so I'm hoping, at least for those people, like, and those individuals, that they'll find the space to say, like, I recognize, right, like that maybe impact it may have had on you, and at least to support like what they're saying, because I think too oftentimes they also get erased from the narrative because it's uncomfortable to say, right, like this was a tool of settler colonialism, that people experience cultural and religious genocide, and that is uncomfortable for people to confront. And I'm hoping that people are able to at least recognize how these structures are detrimental to the lived lives of Indigenous peoples.
Well, Elise, thank you so much for this book. I know people. I was texting Sienna. I was like, you need to be on more podcast shows with this book, because I think it's a topic that really speaks to a lot of sort of interests, especially looking at religious studies. I think people kind of remove that sort of question or religion from the realm of imperialism in those fields, not necessarily in our fields, but this is, I think, a necessary book, and I think it opens up so much conversation around this issue. And I think there's going to be follow-ups to this, obviously, because I was kind of wanting more in terms of like where I want to see where this is going to go next. So The book is Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite. You can find it at the University of Oklahoma Press. You don't actually have a copy of it, but maybe you want to hold your big sign up that you have.
I was joking, but I took this from the Western History Association. The one thing they let me come away with was just my huge.
It's a giant copy. It's a giant copy.
Yeah, I should put it back here. It's probably better. It's a giant copy, but I do want to thank you for allowing me to share, for you to read it, but also to share it on this particular platform. I hope to get my own copy one day to have it. But I also just thank everybody who has supported me through this journey, because I hope this isn't just like a one and done. I want this to open up a conversation between, again, Mormon, Indigenous studies, religious studies, like settler colonialism. There's so much rich ways I think that we can ask some of these questions. But also thank you to everyone who's purchased it. And again, shout out, everyone buy one, gift it for the holidays, get your institutions to buy it, invite me out to speak. There you go.
You heard it here first, folks. So this, again, thank you all for the Patreons who support. If you aren't a Patreon, it's Native American Heritage Month. I'm going to guilt trip you into subscribing. If you're listening to this, if you like this podcast, go to patreon.com/Red Media PR. We dropped the link to the book in the show notes in the chat as well. So check that out. Click on it. Also, it's Native American Heritage Month. So if you don't want to subscribe to our Patreon, at least go to our GoFundMe. It'll also be in the show notes and in the chat. And then lastly, again, we are hiring a new executive director. You can go to our webpage, redmedia.press, to find out more information about that. Thank you so much, Elise, for joining the show. And thanks everyone for joining. This is a very lively conversation, and we had some really great sort of conversation in the chat, as well as trying to bring in some of those questions. So thank you all for participating.
Thank you.